Hi everyone, welcome to the third episode of the Blue Cradle Dialogues. This week I've got a really special guest, Dr. Sylvia Earle, oceanographer and National Geographic Explorer in residence. The conversation this week was really amazing. We talked about the deep ocean, conservation, and really the need to just take a different approach when it comes to protecting the ocean. And so I felt really humbled to have a conversation with a living legend. So I hope you enjoy it, and releasing this on a special day, World Ocean Day. So happy World Ocean Day, everyone. And today we are hosting Sylvia Earle. Welcome, Sylvia.
Nice to be on board.
Great to have you on board. You're such an inspiration. We met a few times. I had the pleasure of meeting you in 2015 at the COP, the Paris COP in 2015, and from learning more about you throughout the years, I've realized just how much of an inspiration you are to thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. So tell us a bit about that. How do you feel? You're inspiring everyone to protect the ocean. How amazing is that?
Well, I want to share the view. I've been privileged to have access to the ocean in ways that most people cannot. I've lived underwater in underwater laboratories 10 times. I was among the first to actually have access to scuba back in the 1950s. So I've had thousands of hours submerged in places, again, because we live now in the 21st century and have the capability of going places and doing things that our predecessors simply could not. And I've used more than 30 different kinds of submarines and remotely operated vehicles as well. So I could be selfish and just kick back and enjoy all these wonderful experiences, but I can't do that. I just feel compelled to try to get others to see what I see and to go where I go. Part of the reason being that since I began diving, more has been learned about the ocean than during all preceding history. I think that's a very safe comment. So much that we did not know that now is widely understood. At the same time, we've lost more. We've been burdened with the concept that the ocean is infinite in its capacity to accept whatever we want to throw into it and to yield whatever we want to take out of it. And the consequences are dire. I have been a witness, and this is the other important thing that I must try to share with anyone who will listen, that the ocean is in trouble. I have not been on a dive, whether it's by snorkeling or going thousands of meters deep in recent years, without seeing some form of trash. And it's even more worrying of the things I don't see, the micro and nanoplastics, the changing chemistry, the changing temperature, all those things that are really set me on fire. I want people to understand it matters. What we do and what we fail to do for the ocean has consequences back to us. It's not just about the fish and the whales and seabirds and turtles and things. We're all in this together. If they're in trouble, we're in trouble. They are, and so are we.
I think what that reminds me of is what Professor Jane Lubchenco said at the UN Decades meeting I attended a couple of years ago, the preparatory meeting. She said that the ocean's not too big to fail. It's not too big to fix. It's too big to ignore. And I think the thing there is that we've always thought the ocean is endless and deep, and we could just throw stuff in it. And I think the first expedition, the Challenger expedition, in the 19th century, we didn't even know there was life down there. We thought it was just dead and barren, and then we realized actually there's stuff down there. We got some live specimens, and they sort of exploded when they got to the surface because they were so pressurized and things like that. And then we started laying the first cables across the Atlantic, and then our industrialization sort of took over, and we started putting lines, invisible lines on the ocean and dividing it all up, and so for me it's so it sort of going back a little bit, taking a step back, as an oceanographer and conservationist, your career spans over several decades. Going way back, what's your earliest memory of the ocean? Where you grew up on the coast somewhere in America?
Actually, for the first 12 years, my family lived about 40 miles from the ocean, so it was not an everyday occurrence, but in the summer, we would travel that distance to the coast. That's where I first met the ocean. I could smell it. There's a difference in the air. And then I could hear the ocean, the waves crashing on the beach. And then finally, coming over the last little stretch, and beyond the dunes, you could see there was this magical stretch of blue. And finally, we got out of our car. I raced over the dunes and I could touch the ocean. And during that, I think I was 3 years old, just a little kid, and was fascinated by the creatures that were along the shore. But I turned my back on the ocean and the wave knocked me over. And for a while it was scary because I got tumbled around in the surf. And my mother could have, and a lot of people say she should have, grabbed me out and probably never let me go back in the ocean again, but she did not. She saw me stand up finally, sort of gasping a bit, but with a big smile on my face. I thought it was first a little scary, but then it was fun. And I've been going back in ever since.
And it reminds me of my son. I have a 4-year-old son, and we were on the beach in New Zealand, and something similar happened. He just went too close to the wave, and he was fully dressed, and he suddenly was fully dressed and fully wet.
And fully soaked.
Yeah, that's probably the first time you turned your back on the ocean, and you never did since.
I do it, but I do it knowing the consequences. You should never ignore the ocean. The ocean really is indifferent. Doesn't know that there's a 3-year-old little girl standing there. It doesn't care. It's just doing its thing. And we have to take into account the laws of nature. We are trying to make our own laws to bend the natural systems, and they just doesn't work. Water flows downhill.
Because we're pretty insignificant. If you think of the scale of the ocean, I've been on certain dives, and I'm sure you have as well, where you're just staring at the abyss, and it's so vast, and we're so little. And so I've been on dives that actually freak out. I think, oh my God, that's a huge drop off, and you're like on the edge of a continent. Yeah. So. Have you ever been scared like that as well? Are you scared of the ocean sometimes?
Well, when I'm not really prepared, such as, and again, it's not the ocean, it's my lack of preparedness. It's my own fault, my own stupidity, such as when I was diving with my friend Al Giddings, and we anchored along Catalina Island in Southern California, just the two of us, nobody in the boat. We left the boat to go diving, and we came back to the surface, and the tide had come up while we were diving. The anchor had lifted off, and it was drifting far out to sea. We could barely see this little speck on the horizon. Al, fortunately, handed over all of his diving gear, puffed up the VC so that it could float. And then he took off swimming and caught up with the boat eventually, thank goodness, and came back, and that was fine. But it's that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The ocean is indifferent, and we just have to be mindful of what we can get away with and not go too deep, not stay too long, be aware of the laws of nature.
Yeah, because of course people die. I mean, there's a lot of accidents every year with diving, and some of the gear that we're using, the rebreathers and the submersibles, maybe not so much, because the risk assessment is generally quite high, and risk mitigation, and so as a yeah,
it's human error usually,
human error, yeah.
A mechanical glitch, but mechanical glitches you expect, and so you have backups. You take precautions. If something breaks, you should have an alternative. It's the idea of keeping a reserve of air. You don't use it all. Although we used to, you know, you could almost see the scuba tanks bend in as you took that last breath. You knew when to stay as long as you possibly could. There was this myth that you could not get into trouble on a single tank of air. Well, we know that now. That's not true. You can get into big trouble without even trying on a single tank of air. But
because you've experienced the whole technological improvements over the years. I mean, you met.
I've been a guinea pig many times.
Yeah. So when Cousteau, Cousteau invented the first two-stage, regulator.
Right.
You were around at that time. Did you dive with him or with the team at the Calypso? And did you hook up with those guys?
No, it was very much of a man's world, except for Cousteau's very lovely wife, Simone, who probably was the most civilized presence on all of the Calypso expeditions. I have not been diving with Jacques Cousteau or Simone, but I have been diving with his son,
Jean-Michel. Yeah.
Michel, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of people don't realize, but all this,
and his grandson
and Pierre, Philippe and Fabian.
I've met most of the family, and
I mean, the technology is not that old, actually, when you think of it, of the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and where we are now. It's only about 60 years old. So and we're still discovering new places in the ocean. But as you've traveled and you're a National Geographic explorer, you've been to many of the most amazing places in the ocean. What's your favorite memory? What's your the place that you feel the most at home in?
When people ask, like, what's my favorite place, I say almost anywhere 50 years ago. I have a special passion for the Gulf of Mexico, because that's where I first really experienced scuba diving. But Jacques Cousteau once remarked that he was so sad because he could not take his sons to see places that he knew as a child. And even more, I heard Jean-Michel say the same thing, that he could not take his children to places that he knew as a child. So much has changed. And I've been a witness to a lot of it. From 1950s, when I first began using scuba, to the present time, more has been learned about the nature of the ocean and life that is in it, the connection between climate and weather, so much that nobody could know before. We did not have the technology in previous times. And we also could not connect the dots the way we now do, to see the patterns, to pull information together. But at the same time, we've lost more. We've seen a catastrophic decline, with 90% of the sharks and the tunas and the swordfishes and so many kinds of marine creatures that have been extracted. Again, following this belief, there's no evidence that it could possibly be true that the ocean is infinite in its capacity to yield whatever we want to take in whatever amount. We have the evidence that the ocean is truly failing, and therefore so are we. We just have to be mindful that we have a chance, not a big window of time, but this is the time, the next 10 years, maybe the most important in all of human history, because either we'll realize the way in 2020, we realized if we don't shape up, if we don't take seriously the effects of this virus, we'll die. People did die. I mean, thousands began dying because we weren't taking the right actions, the right precautions, and people really got it. And we're still in the midst of it. It isn't over yet. Who could have imagined that we could, in such a short time, change so much in terms of travel, in terms of our personal behavior? But we did it because our lives were on the line. We need to do it again because our lives are on the line with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with the planetary functions are disrupted. And that means things we've always taken for granted, we can't anymore. But there is something we can do about it, but we have to hurry.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is that we don't realize how much of a life, like the ocean maintains life on the planet. It regulates, climate, weather. It's transforms carbon into oxygen through photosynthesis, and so your career as an oceanographer, you looked at the processes. You're like, yeah, tell us a little bit about what you did as a researcher. Did you look at chemistry in the oceans? Are you interested in those processes, or more are you looking at physical oceanography, more on the biological side, looking at species discovery? Can you tell us a little bit about your work as an oceanographer?
I feel like a little kid. I want to know everything about everything all the time. And there's no reason why anyone should feel compelled to stay within the narrow confines of one discipline or another. I think it is useful to drill into something that gives you a really deep dive, if you will, into some aspect of life. For me, it was looking at marine plants, seaweeds, and really getting to intimately become acquainted with those that live in the Gulf of Mexico. I studied, it was a 10-year span between getting my master's degree and my PhD, 10 years and 2 children, and many months of actually going back to the same places over and over again throughout the seasons, and trying to document what kinds of plants lived where, and the algae and also the seagrasses, and just to try to see the change and inventory who was there. It was sort of basic natural history, if you will, but laced with getting a baseline of temperature, getting a baseline of salinity through the year at each of these locations. So I guess without knowing what to call it, I was an ecologist in the 60s, and trying to wrap my mind, but then I wrapped my mind around how the seaweeds and the seagrasses and the mangroves and marshes all work to the photosynthesizers, but I found I could not pick up anything without seeing that it was attached and connected to a multitude of other things. A little handful of seaweed, all the amphipods kept popping out. I'd find these little flatworms cruising along the stems, and under a microscope you could see there were sometimes epiphytes that I couldn't see just by looking at it, but when I turned on the microscope, there was like a metropolis of other forms of life, little polychaete worms, protozoans, bryozoans. I mean, it was like an adventure every time that I looked at anything, and it's still that way. If you really keep looking and keep asking questions, there's just simply, there aren't barriers to what you can look at or what you can become acquainted with. That's the great joy of being a 21st century human being. Access to knowledge, unprecedented. I loved going to libraries as a kid. I read William Beebe's Half Mile Down when I was about 12. And it just awakened in me a desire to go see what he described below where sunlight shines. You know, bioluminescence, the flash, sparkle, and glow of these amazing creatures. And at night, sometimes walking along the beach or running along the beach, I usually didn't walk, I ran. Sometimes, you know, as you kick up the sand and the water, you can see when the luminous organisms are present in abundance. It's like the ocean is on fire, blue fire. It's extraordinary. So, well, I have as a centerpiece, I suppose, of my expertise is looking at what kinds of plants live where and why, what factors conspire to make this place appropriate and that place not. why is there this patchiness of distribution? And it's endlessly fascinating. You'll never find all the answers, but at least you can begin to see some patterns and start to answer those questions. But to realize that if you take anything, if you want to know tuna, you really have to know what they eat, where they go. You need to know water chemistry, you need to know water temperature, you need to know the other creatures in the sea that they encounter. And it helps to know as much of their history as possible. I started studying whales with a really notable whale expert, Roger Payne and Katie Payne and the whole family. I called them the growing pains. They're their kids. And it was just to see through their eyes and then for them to see through mine. I saw whales as islands. They had barnacles attached to them, and on the barnacles there were seaweeds. So it was my excuse as a botanist to study whales. They had seaweeds growing on the barnacles that were growing on the whales. But then I woke up to the realization, it's great to specialize, but don't stay in the box. You miss the reality that everything is connected to everything else. And you just can't escape it. If you really want to know, well, it was great to hear who's the scientist who with Cosmos?
Carl Sagan.
Carl Sagan, thank you. He said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, first you must invent the universe. You just peel back the layers. So you want to make an apple pie. Okay, you need apples, you need flour, you need some kind of shortening, you need this, you need that. And then you say, well, where do the apples come from? Okay, just keep going, keep going. They come from a tree, right? But where's the tree come from? And where does it grow? And how did a tree become a tree? And pretty soon you're looking at the origin of life itself. And then you're looking at the origin of the planet itself. And then you're looking at the origin of the universe itself. And all you wanted to do was make an apple pie, but it's all connected.
Yeah.
We are newcomers.
So it's about having that holistic approach to things and understanding how processes, like everything you do, has an impact. The butterfly effect, you can call it whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, exactly. So that brings me to the next question, I think. So over your career, you've found these ecological areas of biological significance. Let's say you've identified lots of them in different scales and biomes. And so later you started a nonprofit called Mission Blue, and you. I think I'm disappearing there. I'm blending with the ocean.
You're diving in. It's wrapping itself around you.
And so you started something called the Hope Spots, and I think our viewers might want to know about that a little bit. What are Hope Spots, and how do they come about? What is a hope spot?
The idea originated during a conversation among some of my fellow explorers at the National Geographic. They're talking about hotspots, places really on the land that are high in diversity, but also have high threat. And the term hotspot to really indicate a sense of urgency about protecting them while there's still time, and that if these areas of high diversity could be protected, they would have a magnified impact on restoring and saving the diversity of life on the land. So it just occurred to me that we should be calling those places hope spots, because they do provide hope. If we could really seriously protect special places on the land and in the ocean that have a magnified impact on driving the way the planet works, there is reason for hope. And that is what's behind the national park system in countries around the world, protecting the land, protecting wildlife, not just places, but also overarching policies like migratory birds, across countries, to be able to give them safe havens during their long journeys. They have a tough enough time facing the natural ups and downs that are not friendly to their survival. But then you add on what we have been doing to wild birds, to wild animals on the land, to forests, to all of the nature that we encounter. And more recently, especially in the last 500 years, the last 300, 200, but mostly the last 50 years, we have really scaled up our approach to large-scale extraction of wildlife from the ocean. Factory ships, really, that did not exist before the middle of the 20th century. It started with factory whaling. Well, look what happened there. We almost eliminated the great whales. But this is cause for hope too. When you stop killing and start caring, you can see a change. There are more whales today than when I was a child, because now whales are protected. It works in the ocean too. Protecting places, even small places, have a magnified impact. And in your country, in New Zealand, some early studies showed that, demonstrating that if you just stop killing things, I mean everything, just leave it alone. You can go there, but don't kill things. Treat a place with respect. You go visit a neighbor's home, you don't, smash the furniture and take the cats and dogs and horses and things and kill them. That's not being a good neighbor. And we have good neighbors with the ocean.
I think that's the strength of marine policy. Over the last 5-6 decades, countries have ramped up their marine spatial plans and trying to understand how we can zone the ocean, and the Convention on the Law of the Sea and things like that have enabled these measures to be taken.
But the problem is right now that some of the ideas about protection, about the law of the sea, about ownership, so many things, the ethic that underlies the law that nations have agreed to. The world was a different place when those laws were formulated, when those policies were put in place, when those catch quotas for taking wildlife were established. There were many more creatures in healthy condition 50 years ago, but our policies haven't caught up with the reality of the 21st century. We've already eliminated so much, 90% of many of the big fish already gone, and we've gone to places that weren't even fished at all in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, like orange Ruffy, a big deal in Australia and New Zealand.
That's right. Yeah.
But nobody knew when the fishing began for them how old they get to be. Orange Ruffy can be more than a century old, decades before they start to reproduce. We can eliminate them from areas and they don't come back. And if ever, it certainly takes longer than a season or 10 years, the lifetime of the fishermen who are there killing them on a large scale. True too with the so-called Chilean sea bass. These are slow-growing, long-lived fish, and they become an economic mainstay in some of the Southern Hemisphere countries, including New Zealand, Australia. But we can, it's like looking at a library and saying, this would make great fuel for a fire. And you go in and you rip the books off the shelves and you make a big bonfire and you destroy it. And you have a great time. You've warmed yourself. You've cooked your meals over the fire. But the most important value of those books of life in the sea is not taking them to kill them. It's their living value and what we can learn from them, and the whole system that has taken 4.5 billion years to develop. And it's taken us about 4.5 decades to significantly unravel. What's with that? We think we're so smart, but what's intelligent, let alone wise, about going to a place, Antarctica, where we have never in the history of our species lowered a hook or a net before, and then start doing it in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, after we'd already in the subantarctic islands really taken the numbers of seals and birds and whales down to almost extermination levels. And then we stopped doing that by international policy, but we turned our attention to krill and fish that, of course, all of those other animals rely on for their sustenance. There's more than one way to kill a penguin or a whale. Just take what they eat and they'll starve, or they'll be so unhealthy, diminished in their robustness that they're vulnerable to disease. And they can't make the long journey. They may not die just right away, but they're certainly more vulnerable.
I think we've gone in excess of what the planet is able to sustain, and I think what you're suggesting is that we should go potentially in excess the other way, and I think a lot of people around the world don't agree with the Western-centric view of excessive consumption and excessive industrialization of natural resources. And
well, there are many Westerners who don't agree with that view too.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the other extreme of closing off areas is sometimes seen as counterproductive, because then you go against the local livelihoods and things like that. So I think, like, I'm thinking especially here in New Zealand and across the Pacific, there's
I understand. And I that for the most part, people who have a deep history in a place and have over the ages treated the wild places knowing that there are limits, they treat them with respect. Even so, some species have gone extinct because too much has been taken, even when it's sustenance, even when it with the best of intentions. But we're talking now 21st century. This is not the 1500s or the 1400s, or not even the 1900s. We have so depleted the ocean that every tuna counts. And when even indigenous people are taking wildlife and selling it, using fish for money, that's a different step. That's not fish because you're hungry. It's fish because you can get money for the other things that are desirable in life. Nothing wrong with that. People make a living. It's not just feeding yourself, it's also taking from nature to foster your prosperity. People do this across the planet. We mine the oil and coal and diamonds and gold and cut the trees, and It's what humans have done throughout all of our history, but we now are all in this together. And what we could get away with even 50 years ago, we can't do today. We cannot, and still have a trend toward recovery. We can continue to kill the tunas and mine the orange Ruffy, although that there's no indigenous taking of orange Ruffy. That's all new with 20th century, now 21st century technology, and marketing tuna to distant destinations. That's new in the 20th century too, mostly the latter part of the 20th century. So I think we really have to think it through.
So you think that, yeah, desperate case calls for desperate measures, and we should consider large scale or even medium to large scale protection, which would be a regeneration of the ocean, and we should regenerate the ocean.
It really works.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, we have to stop the killing and the polluting. We just have to change. We know now that our lives depend on it. 2020 was a big wake-up call. Can we not learn from that and realize that there are bigger problems that we have been ignoring, neglecting, that climate change is real, the loss of diversity is real, that our life support decline is real, that this is the only safe haven for humankind and all the rest of life on Earth in all of the universe. This is home. Why can't we use all the voices together to take care of our home? The people who have lived for long periods of time in a place have a kind of wisdom that is really critical, but they are also living in the 21st century and see things that they would like to have that are not compatible with the old ways of treating nature. I mean, the new ways of treating nature, that to take enough fish from the sea to feed your families and your communities. That's the way societies prospered over millennia. But when you start taking on a large scale and using wildlife to buy things, it's like elephants have become targeted for their ivory. You kill the wildlife for money. You kill the cheetahs for their skins. You take bears for their paws. It's using wildlife for monetary gain.
That's right. Yeah.
There are only so many wild birds. We used to do it with birds. We don't do that as much today as once was the case. Can't we learn about the real value of these animals, that their greatest value is their living value, and what we can learn from them that transcends just dead meat or products?
Yeah, I mean, what I call it is probably just greed. I think the greed of and the capitalist model has enabled a small percentage to profit from a large amount of pillage. It's pillaging of resources from one side of the planet to the other, and there's a north-south divide between the rich countries and the poor countries. And I think a lot of people agree that's it's now been unraveled. I think a lot of people are more aware of it, and films like Seaspiracy and films like that are unraveling those things. And I think the next question sort of comes naturally. So overfishing and climate change, those two issues are sort of pretty important when it comes to ocean conservation. And so which do you think is the most pressing issue, worrying? Which one should we be more worried about? Overfishing, climate change and its impacts?
They're all linked together. The loss of wildlife in the ocean is a blue carbon ocean chemistry issue, but it's more than that. I think another film that really struck to the heart of some of the problems that we now face was My Octopus Teacher.
Yeah, I prefer that one, actually. Yeah.
Well, it kind of bookends. Here's the tragedy of just looking at the ocean as a source of money, products, and a place to dump things. But we need a strong dose of empathy. We think that we're so special because we can feel the pain of others, that we call it, we're being humane. And yet, look at what we do even to our fellow humans and to the animals that we cultivate for food. We don't treat them very nicely either. But especially when we look at the ocean, fish, a child would not do to a fish what they're taught is okay to do. Culturally, we have hardened ourselves to believe that fish feel no pain, or that they're just there for us to take, that they don't have a social structure that's worth our consideration.
I mean, you and I both know when we go diving that when you look at a fish, he might be in the same hole every day and the same anemone every day, and you go back and
they're looking at you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We go out. I used to say, I went out to watch the whales, and I found that the whales were watching me. It's true with fish too.
Yeah.
They come out and really look at you, and sometimes, depending on the species, but some are really so curious. The grouper, called by whatever name, Mero in the potato cod in Australia.
Yeah.
They are just so smart and so curious. They are just. It pains me to see them on the menu when you know who they are, not what they are, but who they are, and the holes we're leaving in the ocean when we extract them just as products. I mean, this casual term that we use for ocean wildlife, we call it seafood, as if everything in the ocean is fair game. And it kind of is. But we have to change that if we're going to survive. Not if they're going to survive, if we are going to survive. We need them. We need them alive.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I think there's a lot of people out there that are trying to make a case for sustainable fisheries, and I think sustainable fisheries is a very complicated debate, and it's pretty difficult to tackle that now. But I think
it is. I think it is difficult, but it's the evidence is staring us in the face. A wise guy once said that seeing the obscure may take some time. The perfectly obvious, we see eventually. The perfectly obvious takes more time. It's perfectly obvious that we are taking more life out of the ocean than the ocean can replenish. When you're down in 50 years to only 10% of many different species, and some, like the oceanic white-tip shark, in half a century, we've depleted down to maybe 1%. I mean, are there enough left to even recover? The bluefin tuna in the North Pacific, their numbers are down to under 3%. I mean, what's sustainable? When they get back up to 6%, we've doubled the number, and so we can start killing them again. I mean, this is not rational. This is not looking clearly at what should be obvious. It is taking some time, but we don't have time.
Do you have faith in international policy legislation that's currently underway in terms of the high seas? We're going to have a framework for high seas regulation. What about the Southern Ocean? Do you think the policy, decisions that are coming up, do you think we will have eventually a robust framework that will enable these areas to replenish and bounce back, or do we have to follow another approach? What's the
start? It's a move in the right direction. It's better than we are today, but as I earlier observed, this is not the same planet that existed when those policies were set in motion. There has been a move that endorsed by many over many years, going back to at least the 1980s, to fully protect the open sea. And when the concept of high seas when enough nations became signatories to UNCLOS, the law of the sea, so that we have this international agreement that out 200 miles nations have jurisdiction, but everything else is the global commons. I mean, there's some fuzzy edges there in the Arctic with Russia wanting to claim more than 200 miles. And it's true in places all over the world that when the natural configuration of the seafloor suggests that maybe nations can get away with taking more than just 200 miles, they are trying to exert their claims accordingly. But the fact is that nearly half of the world is beyond national jurisdiction in the high seas. And if we could treat that as a global public trust and exclude fishing, there is no indigenous population that would be harmed. None, because people normally don't even go 100 miles offshore, let alone 200. For high seas voyagers, like the Polynesian voyagers, it's different. You're just out there and you're just feeding yourself as you travel.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if you're in a modern sailing vessel and you want to catch dinner, okay. But industrial trawling, industrial longlining, industrial fishing, there's no place for that on this planet anymore. It's too destructive. Everybody's paying the cost. And only about 5 nations are significantly achieving gain. And even that is subsidized.
Yeah.
And you think about taxpayers in a small number of countries paying, literally subsidizing industrial fishing from the global commons. What's wrong with this picture? Everything's wrong with this picture. Why do we have such a hard time about saying we just have to stop?
To feed cats and dogs and put cans of tuna on shelves in European or American supermarkets, that sort of thing.
But that's not feeding. That's not food security.
No.
Oh, that's food choice, and it's a luxury choice, and it's costing us dearly to be able to allow a relatively small number of people to have the ability to have a tuna sandwich. When you think of all of the people of the world, not only now, but all the people in the world coming, when there won't be tuna anymore because we've basically gotten them to such low levels that they're gone.
Yeah, I think I mean, for those decisions to happen, I think the countries need to understand that the global commons and have a value on that. So the economic valuation is often seen as, especially by indigenous traditions and cultures, as something that's kind of counterproductive. It's even more commodification of the natural resources. But do you believe that we can protect it if you don't put a number on it? Is that what you're suggesting, that we should put a number on high seas resources and keep it as a bank of?
No. Oh no. I think we should just recognize it keeps us alive. This is blue heart of the planet. It's the principal area where oxygen is generated and carbon is captured. And most people, I know, well, at least most of those I encounter, seem not to understand. Most of life on Earth lives in the dark.
Yeah.
It's cold and it's under high pressure. It's the high seas, it's the deep sea. And it's relatively, compared to places we occupy on the land and along the shore, it's relatively intact. It's the library. We should respect it for the library of life, the secrets of nature, the answers to questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where might we be going?
We don't need it in the library. That's the rule.
Don't burn the library.
Yeah, but
don't chop it up and serve it in little mini sandwiches.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we don't know. I think we've only discovered about 10% of marine species. So there's so much more to discover. We're at the start of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development.
it isn't even just how many species are there, it's who are they and what are they doing? How do they live their lives? And how do we fit in to this extraordinary network of life? We can put a name on a coral or a fish or a sponge and check it off. Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. And I've been doing that all my life, basically, of taking inventory. But when you realize that's just a little piece of meat, that is not what that animal is, or who that animal is, or what they're doing, or how they try to imagine that you live 1,000 meters or 10,000 meters under the sea. You're oblivious to the workings of humankind. You don't care about us, but we should be caring about them because they shape the planet in ways that make Earth favorable for us. They don't intend to do it. They're just doing their thing. And we need to understand them. What about chemosynthesis in the deep sea? Another method for manufacturing, synthesizing food in the absence of light. This is a process that only became kind of understood somewhat in the deep sea in the late 1970s on into the 80s, not that long ago, that we even began to account for this process of synthesizing food in the absence of light. Chemosynthesis. It happens on the land. We just hadn't taken it into account in the soil. The bacteria are busily working away, doing their thing.
That's helping astrobiologists as well discover life on other planets under ice, right. Crust, potentially.
On methane and sulfur.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of theories, about the origins of life, and it's quite a few of them are linked to life at the bottom of the ocean and those areas of hydrothermal vents and places like that.
I'm far less focused on sustaining the extraction of fish from the sea than I am on keeping fish in the sea and restoring their populations and restoring their social structure and restoring these connections that we have so brutally broken. And it isn't just food chains, they're behaviors. I mean, who knew until about the last 10 years or so, and mainly because divers have been out there observing life, reporting, hey, did you know I saw a grouper and a moray eel out there fishing together? And it's real. The grouper goes up and makes a little wiggle motion with his fins and to where he knows, obviously, where a moray is hanging out, and the moray comes out of its hole and off they go. Or later, other divers have said, I saw the most remarkable thing, a grouper and an octopus. You think an octopus would be a tasty meal for a grouper. No, those guys get together and they go off hunting together. And who knew? And if you just look at pounds of meat, if you just look at octopus as a delicious hors d'oeuvre, pickled octopus, baby octopus, you see it on menus everywhere, you would never care about the reality of how smart they are, or these social connections, these communities that are so intricate. We're just beginning to know enough to ask the questions that lead to more questions. Like, what are the relationships between bacteria and us, our microbiome, and then to realize that every fish has its own microbiome, that corals have microbiomes, that we think about competition as the driving force between, evolution, but really it's collaboration. It's these systems, these species joining up, working together, building together. And when you think, how do we get to where we are? It's because of the collaboration among people, discoveries that get passed along generation to the next, working together to have the clothes we wear, the technology that we have come to take for granted. They're engines that are built here, and there is fuel that comes from there, and there's sound producing devices that make music that have come from dozens of different cultures around the world over long periods of time, that we're all the beneficiaries. Even language, the use of numbers, it's something that should make us step back and have a sense of humility and wonder, and not be so busy to go out there and kill everything as if it's our job to do that.
It's really inspiring, and this approach to personify species, I think, is a great one. I think you think of the Disney films, even with Nemo and Dory and things like that are quite naive in a way, but actually are quite effective. And I'm thinking of Cousteau as well. Back in the day, they used to give names to the creatures they found, the turtles and the morays and the groupers. And so I think we need more of that. I think that approach is quite effective, and I think it sparks in us this spirit of awe and wonder and excitement. And
Cousteau went through a transition that he used to see how many fish he could kill on a single dive. I mean, there were still people who are doing that. There's shark tournaments. See how many dead sharks you can create. See how many fish you can catch. You're not hungry. You just want to, it's a sport to go kill something. And he was kind of in that category for a while, but he learned. He in his later years was appalled at not understanding. And I'm appalled that we still have policies and laws that do not take into account the reality of where we are. It should be obvious to everyone, everywhere, when you have a 90% decline, and occasionally when you take measures, a small recovery. That doesn't mean, it's okay to go kill them. No, we should be 21st century human beings armed with knowledge and understanding that a live fish is worth more than a dead fish. A live coral reef is worth so much more than one that is converted into building materials or just casually destroyed because you dump agricultural chemicals, runoff, fertilizer from the land and allow it to be destroyed. How many coral reefs, how many mangroves, how many marshes have been converted into parking lots because it seemed like a good idea at the time? How much has been lost through indifference to the real value of living natural systems?
Yeah, I think that's what governments need to realize, is that the value is far more greater when they're intact, the ecosystems and species, than when they're transformed or when they're mobilized and extracted in different ways. And so I think we're slowly running out of time, but I think it's the sort of conversation that could go on for a long time, and I think we've touched upon some really important points there. I think what I get out of it is that we are at a crossroads. We are at an important time, and you said it earlier. We've got the UN decade, we've got the 2030 agenda, we've got the next 10 years, as you say, the most important in our history, human history. We've got large events coming up in the next few months and next year as well. We've got the climate conferences, and we've got ocean conferences, and we've got marine protected area congresses. And so I'm expecting we might cross paths at some of those, hopefully. And one of the congresses we are trying down here is to bring it here to the South Pacific in 2026, so mid-decades, to check in and give it a final push. So that's what I just wanted to let you know that we are advocating and consulting widely for the sixth MPA Congress to come to Christchurch, Ototahi, as they call it here, in 2026. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and also Vancouver next year. And so we're talking with the team there to connect the dots. Yeah. And yeah, what are your thoughts on those events? What do you think they're effective?
Well, it is what people do. We get together, we share what we know, hoop it up, and leave meetings inspired and maybe empowered with new connections to go forward and make the world a better place. We have, in 2020, really become more savvy about the kind of meeting that we're having right now. I'd love to come to New Zealand, and I will. I'll be there for 2026. Count on it. But meanwhile, I can travel across the globe. In 2019, I did the most travel perhaps in all of my professional life, or life period. And then it stopped, except I actually visited more people in more nations in 2020 when I didn't step on an aircraft or a boat for a full year.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I hunkered down and used that time to try to pull things together for an ocean book that will come out in November of this year with National Geographic.
Brilliant.
So some of the questions you were asking about specializing in physical or chemical oceanography, or become a specialist with whales or corals or whatever, I've taken a deep dive into trying to find out the latest and greatest updates on what's happening, who knows what, and what are we thinking about it? What are the policies that we need? Here's what we've got, but what do we need to safeguard Earth as a habitable place in the universe that really is pretty unfriendly to the likes of us? Try living on Mars.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that sounds brilliant. I'm really excited about that book. And just to clarify, we are doing more and more virtual meetings, and we are in fact building a hybrid Congress. So that's really something important now, I think, is to have
it expands the reach.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Not, for everyone who can actually physically attend, you can greatly magnify that and then keep it rolling by recording it. And it's just cause for hope that we have this powerful new means of communicating.
Yeah, that's right. You're one side of the Pacific, I'm on the other, and here we are. And no, thank you so much, Sylvia. And yeah, really appreciated this conversation. I think one last question. Do you think it's actually possible that we could, in fact, rename Earth Ocean? Do you think it's something that...
I'm sure the whales already call it that.
Yeah, I'm sure they do, and all the other ones, the fish and the squid. But it's one thing. Yeah, I mean, we are really on planet ocean. 71% of it is covered, and so the work that we do is to promote ocean literacy and to really make people understand. And you're very much in that field as well, and so looking forward to more of this, more collaboration, and hopefully we can do some exciting things together.
Count on it. Look forward to it.
Brilliant. And thank you again. I'll stop the recording. Thank you to our viewers for staying on this long.